Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Paul Worcester. Paul, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
I'm excited to be with you. It's an honor.
We're going to talk about reaching college students, but first let me tell you about Paul. Paul is the National Collegiate Director for the North American Mission Board, where he focuses on encouraging, inspiring, and equipping collegiate leaders on 900-plus campus ministries across North America. In 2001, Paul and his wife, Christy, planted Christian Challenge at California State University, Chico, from scratch. Since then, they saw a movement of God with more than 1,000 college students indicating decisions to become followers of Christ, with many growing as disciples and learning to multiply their faith. Paul is the author of several books, including Tips for Starting a Collegiate Ministry or a College Ministry and Do More with Less Time. All of us need that, but we should probably just talk about that today. He has degrees from University of Oklahoma, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Paul and Christy have two children, Owen and Evelyn. So, Paul, let's jump into these questions. Tell us how you came to faith in Christ and how the Lord led you then into college ministry.
Yes, I came to Christ at a young age, very young, and my dad was reading the Bible to our family, and I just remember having this sense of conviction come over me, knowing that I wasn't right with God. And I remember going into my dad's room that night after everyone else went to bed and just said, "Dad, I'm going to hell." And he said, "I know, son." And he ended up sharing the gospel with me. And I remember walking out of that room with an assurance of salvation and a genuine encounter with God, knowing that I had a relationship with God from that point forward. And then had a growing relationship with God throughout growing up. But it wasn't one of the pivotal moments in my life was at University of Oklahoma. I got involved in the Baptist Collegiate Ministry there. And the director at the time, Max Barnett, discipled my twin brother and I. And so that's one part of my story too. Our family has two sets of twins. And so in a church planter family, so we would always go. It was a fun growing up situation. Yeah. And we lived in multiple different places growing up. So that's just kind of that's in my DNA, church planning, missions, evangelism, seeing my parents do that. But getting to sit down with Max Barnett, with my twin brother, I had already had an experience, basically a calling to ministry experience during a winter conference when a guy named Nick Ripken, it's his fake name, right. But he talks about the persecuted church, and he has to use that name kind of as to protect himself. And I remember hearing these stories of these people literally willing to risk their lives to share the gospel. And I was living on the dorm floor thinking, if these guys can risk their lives to share the gospel, I can risk a little rejection by walking down the hall and sharing my faith. And so we actually started a Bible study, my brother and I, and we knocked on every door of the 4-story dorm every Tuesday night and bribed them with free pizza. And, we had about 20 other fellow freshmen coming to this Bible study. And that's when Max Barnett, legendary disciple maker, saw what we were doing and was like, hey, ministry is good, but making disciples is better. And so what are you doing with these 20 guys that are just doing Bible studies? Let's disciple them. Let's train them up. And he gave me this little card, and on it had one side the reference of 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. The other side had the reference and, had both that reference and verse. And I took that little card home and memorized it that week just because I didn't want to be the twin that didn't have his verse memorized, And after 3 or 4 weeks, though, because I thought scripture memory was just for Awanas, just for kids kind of thing. But after 4 or 5 weeks of memorizing a verse a week, God began to transform my mind. I had some struggles, personal struggles, that it was like washing clean water of a dirty cup, just cleaning my mind, Romans 12:2. And so that was a pivotal moment for me. And basically during my time at University of Oklahoma, God called me to collegiate ministry. And I felt like, if God could do in others' lives what he did in my life, that's worth giving my whole life to. And now I'm more convinced than ever. I say this all the time, but if I had 1,000 lives, I would give them all to college students because I think they're so strategic.
Yeah, what a great testimony. So, Paul, we're going to talk about reaching college students, but give us a picture of this generation, if you would. What's important to them? What are they struggling with? What are they searching for? What are your observations?
Yes, when I think about this generation, really two words come to mind: urgency and opportunity. Those are the two words, because there's both of those things are happening side by side. And really, my favorite verse when I think about this generation is Matthew 9:36-38. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they are harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his field." And I see the brokenness of many in this generation. They grow up, and actually we've seen an accelerate of mental health issues, pornography addiction, and just general darkness in students' lives, because now the college students now, they were young when COVID happened. It's been years now, and their most formative time was they were in isolation, and all they had was this little device. And so many of them struggle with social anxiety. And a recent study by a ministry that helps Christian college students overcome pornography, they did a study that 89% of young Christian college men admitted to looking at pornography weekly.
Wow.
So that's not just the non-Christians, that's the guys in our Bible studies. So it's just become an epidemic that we're seeing. But what we're finding is that students are coming to the end of themselves sooner. They're realizing that they need something, they need hope, they need truth, they need something, and Jesus is the way. Jesus is the hope. He's the truth. So, and all this self-help only gets you so far. And if self is the problem, how can self be the solution? And so Jesus, and so when they hear the gospel, actually bold gospel preaching and personal gospel conversations, we're seeing many get saved on the spot.
Yeah.
Just they had no biblical background, no warming up to it.
Wow.
And they're just getting flat out saved. My buddy Shane Pruitt, I do ministry with, he told me that in the last few years, he's seen more students saved than in the 18 years of itinerant ministry that he had combined.
Wow.
So it was just, and we're seeing similar things. We're seeing collegiate ministries, local collegiate ministries, double the amount of people that they're seeing come to Christ like last year than they did in many previous years. So there's an incredible urgency, brokenness, and lostness. The average college campus across North America, this is counting Canada, is about 5% reached with the gospel. Yeah. And so in some places it's 10, being generous, it's 10. But still, you think about it, 9 out of 10 students on our college and university campuses, if nothing changes, they're going to live a life of bondage to sin, a life of emptiness, and an eternity in hell.
So, Paul, when you think about college students, you're thinking ages roughly 18 to 22, somewhere in there. Why is it important to try and reach those students, or to reach those students at that season in life?
Well, because people tend to come to Christ in trouble and transition. Those are kind of two times that a lot of times we find that adults come to Christ. And this is the first major transition in a person's life, is they get to kind of reinvent themselves. And actually, we're finding many students that grew up in church that they may not have been genuinely saved even, are getting born again during their freshman year of getting involved in a college ministry. And then there's many that didn't grow up in church, but they are desperate for friends. They're looking for belonging. They're looking for friends. They're looking for fun. And those first month of a college student's experience is one of the best times to reach them for the gospel, because they're literally desperate for belonging. And so if we can do fun events, we can do community outreach, we can share the gospel with them. We find that this combination of transition and then trouble, a lot of them have that depression, have that loneliness, have things that maybe, according to us, older people, they're minor problems, minor trouble, but they're very real troubles to them. This girl, I can't get this girl's attention, or I don't fit in this group. But again, they're coming to the end of themselves. And we're just seeing an openness I've never seen before on college and university campuses.
So Paul, many Kentucky churches are located in close proximity to one of our 100 plus campuses on the state. Many are not as close. Some have a vibrant college ministry, others do not. What would you say to a church that would like to be more effective at reaching college students? What can they do to start and then continue to progress in that work?
Yes, I mean, the best bet is to connect with your regional Baptist Collegiate Ministry directors, and each in Kentucky, especially, primarily a lot of people are listening in Kentucky, but in really across the nation, we have state directors and we have regional leaders that can connect you. And sometimes there's already a work going on that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can come alongside what God is already doing and what experts on the campus are leading out in. But also, if you're not in a community that has a lot of traditional college students, I've seen a lot of fruit lately in starting a college-aged young adult ministry. So we got to think beyond just the traditional college campus, but this whole demographic of 18 to 25-year-olds, many of them are working jobs, or they're pursuing non-traditional they're not just going to college, they're doing other things. And so we need to reach them with the gospel also. And so our church here, I live in Hawaii now, and due to my wife's health, but one of the churches we're partnering with has a young adult ministry that meets monthly. So it's not a huge strain on programming, but they meet once a month, provide free food and teaching and a chance for the young adults to come together. And we're seeing about one young adult a week come to know Christ and get baptized across the street in the ocean. It's just a very, very, very photogenic thing. But it's amazing what you do because college students and young adults, they tend to flock together. And so if you're a church that doesn't have a lot of that going on, consider starting with the small group of young adults or college students that you have and ask them to lead the charge, because the best person to reach a student with the gospel is another student, really, when you think about it.
So, Paul, you referenced some of the larger events, and I hear you describing the small groups. So you're talking reaching students one to many, one to some, and one to one. We just recently had a gathering in Kentucky, 700 plus college students. A bunch of folks were saved there. I think Shane may have preached at that. And,
yes.
So tell us some stories about how you're seeing students come to faith in Christ, and just what you're seeing. How the gospel is impacting college campuses.
Yes, it's almost impossible to capture and to describe all the different things that God's doing. I mean, I even think about Daniel Johnson, who's at University of Kentucky. In the last few years, they went from having about 100 students involved to having over 300 coming around the ministry. And this is not just Christians, when I call it sometimes sheep stealing, just going to, but it's people coming to faith in Christ. Actually, some of the most exciting stories of what God's doing on campuses are in your state. I mean, EKU, man, they're like overflowing their building. They're just out of space. And so I don't know, maybe you guys need to raise some more money for them, or I don't know.
There you go.
I don't know. But that's good problems to have. But
hey, I appreciate you saying that. So our campus ministry work is funded through the cooperative program, and campus ministry is probably the largest single budget item of our in-state work. There's 7 full-time guys, 1 part-time one, that are on the 7 largest campuses, and then the K-State University as well. So I appreciate you mentioning that plug. And Paul, they are outstanding, and they're excellent on their campus, but they're also excellent at helping churches that want to think about what you're describing, reaching students.
Couple more examples. I have a friend in Waco at Baylor University, the BCM Baptist Student Ministry, and there's a church-based ministry leader, Drew, and they've really put an emphasis on prayer in their ministries, both of those. And actually, it's become this I would call it a mini revival that's taken off on the campus, where it used to be the average Baylor student was kind of lackadaisical about their faith, if they had a faith. But now there's hundreds of students that are on fire for the Lord. And it started with this unity of, they did a 72-hour prayer tent in the middle of the campus. And it slowly grew year after year to now they have thousands of students that sign up for time slots. And even at 3 a.m., Drew sent me a picture of 300 students praising God and worshiping God at 3 a.m. And they're seeing students come to Christ daily on that campus as well. And so I could take you to California, where there's campuses. UC Santa Cruz is one of the most dark campuses, spiritually dark campuses that I know, liberal, kind of very extreme political views. And we have a couple that just moved there, and last school year they saw 40 students come to Christ doing grassroots evangelism and disciple making on one of the most difficult campuses. So it's not all just big events. A lot of it is our ministry leaders, the Baptist Collegiate ministry leaders and church-based SBC leaders, I think are some of the most strategic leaders in the nation, because they have a vision for not only preaching the gospel broadly to groups, but creating a culture of evangelism and disciple making where students are on the front lines of sharing their faith with other students.
And Paul, we're seeing that. And so, to use an old-fashioned term, and it is old-fashioned, our campus guys they're just soul winners. I mean, they are personally, daily, trying to lead people to Jesus in one-on-one gospel conversations, gospel appointments, and they're training others to do the same. Last year, they trained, I think, 671 people to share the gospel. They had more than 5,500 gospel conversations logged. I mean, that's the business right there. So, Paul, a lot of our campuses in Kentucky are community colleges, which is a totally different experience. Folks are non-traditional students. They're driving in many cases. Have you seen any models that have been especially successful on a community college campus?
Yes, actually, great question. We were putting together, I was part of a team of collegiate leaders. They were talking about how can we get more ministry on community college or commuter colleges, where there's not a big residential thing. And we were basically figuring out that there's actually, across the nation, there's 1,774 campuses that have no gospel ministry, no crew, no whatever, you fill in the blank. And we realized that a lot of these places have a dozen or more churches within striking distance of the campus. And so what we did, our team, we did interviews, Zoom interviews with churches. We emailed all the BCM state directors and asked, who do you know as far as churches reaching community colleges? And we did interviews with them, and we discovered some incredible stories of ordinary churches reaching forgotten campuses. Because a lot of times it's the flagship campuses and the big ministries and a lot of funding. But really, we heard about a church that had a building right next to one of the campuses, and all they did was once a week, and the students were parking at their on their building illegally, kind of, they're just kind of asking forgiveness rather than permission. And but instead of like giving them citations, they invited them for a weekly cookout where they cooked burgers and invited them and just loved on the students. And now there's 40 college students from that campus that are attending that church. And they didn't even start a new program, but they just said, instead of kind of being, locking things down, they were more generous and open-handed. And they saw just incredible fruit from loving, serving, and then that led to gospel conversations. One more story. There was a guy from a normal campus. He was actually, he was prayer walking this campus, and he realized, he saw the different major buildings, the nursing and all these different programs, and he realized, hey, there's nurses in our church. What if I connected the nurses in our church with the nursing students, and I kind of connected them, and maybe they started a Bible study just for nursing students, and even found ways to kind of talk about what does it mean to get into the nursing, sphere and the career and all that kind of. So using that career interest to spark evangelistic Bible studies, and they ended up starting dozens of these mini ministries based around the affinity groups on campus. So
well, very, very exciting.
So that's one way to think about it. Yeah.
So, Paul, there's a perception that college students are difficult to reach because they've been taught there's no such thing as objective truth. What are some of the unique challenges to reaching college students with the gospel?
You can tell I'm pretty positive about that. I feel like they are more open than we realize. Right. I think one of the barriers is in our own mind more than anything. Is I think a lot of times a lack of faith ends up producing a subsequent lack of sharing the gospel because the harvest is plentiful.
Right.
The problem is not with the harvest. The problem is a lack of laborers. And so there really are more students on our campuses willing to hear and respond to the gospel than there are Christians willing to share the gospel. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that every student is open and is going to repent on the spot, but it does mean that there are many that are at least open to having the conversation. A recent Barna study showed that Gen Z comes and goes from spiritual conversations with much more ease than millennials do. Millennials feel awkward about it, but Gen Z, it's not as personal to them or something to have those conversations. So you can bring up spiritual conversations and it doesn't ruffle their feathers in the same way that millennials it might have. But there are entrenched worldview issues that a certain percentage of them have. There are addictions that they have. There are spiritual strongholds. There's all sorts of things that can be a hindrance to to reaching a Gen Z student with the gospel. And then one kind of, it's a pro and a con, but Gen Z tends to flock together where they have their little friend group. And that's why it's such a great opportunity to reach a freshman before they get their little clique. But more so even than millennials, they have this impenetrable membrane of relationships. And so I'm training leaders now to pray not only to reach an individual, but to pray that we'll be able to reach a whole friend group with the gospel. And kind of this whole person of peace concept that Jesus talked about in Luke 10, where you can reach one student, but instead of extracting them from their friend group, send them back in, or even go back in and start evangelistic Bible study for that group. And we're seeing whole groups of students come to Christ at the same time. So Paul, that's a pro and a con, really.
If you're on a campus and you're doing one-to-one evangelism, how are you trying to share the gospel? Like, what's your approach? How are you starting that conversation? If it's a cold call conversation, and then how are you trying to present or share the gospel?
Yes. We found kind of several methods that are very effective, and really a ministry that's trying to reach the campus should do all three. They should do ministry mode, large group events, inviting people in, small groups, kind of planned ministry activities, okay? And then initiative evangelism. So that's what you're talking about, kind of sparking those spiritual conversations. And then relational evangelism. So ongoing relational evangelism in affinity groups, which I find to be the bread and butter, where if you can get into a athletic team where you can build relationships on the football team, and maybe as a minister, you can become the chaplain of the football team, and over time share the gospel. Over the course of a school year, your goal is to share the gospel with every single guy on that football team. That's like, we've seen the most fruit from that method. Or if we have a student that's already on the football team, equipping them to live on mission in that space. So that's kind of those three. I say you do all three, but as I'm talking to kind of random encounters, and what I've learned is there's nothing random about random evangelism, is that God is sovereign. He's in control. And so, but I'll start a conversation, and sometimes we'll use a survey approach, like a spiritual life survey, and we'll walk up to a student and say, hey, we're doing this spiritual life survey, ask some interesting questions about what people believe about faith. You have a few minutes to have a conversation about that. And so you're getting permission and ask some pretty basic evangelism questions, like actually open-ended, and then it gets more narrow as we go. But the first one is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is the spiritual area of your life? Mm-hmm. And they can kind of have a conversation about that. And this is an interesting one. If you could ask God one question and you knew you would get an answer, what would you ask? Yeah. And so that keeps it more theoretical. And then we do get to the traditional kind of evangelism explosion question. You know, we ask them about eternity, but then we say, if you die right now and God asks you, why should I let you into heaven, what would you say? Yeah. So that question still works well, because it gets to kind of the heart of the issue. Mm-hmm. And we say, hey, we have a short illustration that explains how you can be 100% sure about having a relationship with God and going to heaven when you die. You mind if we show that to you? It'll take about 5 minutes. And we'll either use the 3 circles, mm-hmm. or we'll use the bridge illustration, the 1-verse bridge illustration. Right. But gospel appointments are, and so have a conversation as much as you can in the moment. But then I love starting a spiritual conversation. And because a lot of us, we find that you can't get a full 20-minute conversation as you're walking to class, but you say, hey, this is really interesting. I'd love to grab lunch or coffee with you and talk more about this. Man, what would be a good time this week that we could kind of hang out and spend a few minutes talking more about this? Mm-hmm. And then once you're at the meeting, it's their story, your story, God's story. Those kind of 3-story outline. And we even have a gospel lesson that our ministry does. And Chico, when I was in Chico, that they would it's a 15-minute in-depth gospel presentation, that kind of a Bible study that they would walk through. And we saw a ton of students come to Christ through that gospel appointment method. Really, if I had to choose one method for sharing the gospel for the rest of my life, it would be the gospel appointment. Yeah. Because it mixes the best practices of relational evangelism mm-hmm. and initiative. It's kind of intentional relational evangelism. It's kind of in the middle there. And I think that's where a lot of people are ready for that sort of approach.
Paul, you and Shane Pruitt host a podcast called the Gen Sin Podcast. Tell us about that and any other resources you think might be helpful for our listeners.
Yes, the Gen Sin Podcast is so much fun. We're hitting on topics that it's for ministry leaders, but we're hitting on basically hot topics and essential topics that a lot of times we'll bring in a guest, but sometimes it's just Shane, Lacey, and I is part of the conversation as well. Lacey, she's kind of the host, and mm-hmm. she's the brains behind the operation, if you know what that's like. But we have so much fun. We talk about all sorts of issues. Recent podcasts, we talked about how to maximize your time as a collegiate leader. Mm-hmm. We talked about LGBT plus issues. We talked about politics and how to have conversations with students on politics. We talked about depression, anxiety, pornography, evangelism, how to create a culture of evangelism in your ministry. A lot of how-to on really relevant topics. So that's the Gen Sin Podcast. But one resource I'm really excited about is we took the Creating a Culture of Evangelism kit mm-hmm. that our NAM evangelism team put together, and God's really using across the nation. Mm-hmm. And we created a collegiate version of that. And it's videos by Shane and I and Catherine, who's on our NAM evangelism team. Mm-hmm. And it's 10-minute videos, and it has reflection guides, and you can take your whole team through it as for staff development or leadership development. And we created one for collegiate leaders and one for youth leaders. So, and now there's a course that no matter what lane of ministry you're in, you can take that course. And it's really, with that philosophy, the best person to reach a student is another student. And so how do you equip students to become a viral movement on your campus or in your community? And then we just released a series of 4 ebooks for collegiate leaders that we're really excited about. Those are free. And you can find all those resources at gensin.org.
Paul, tell us about last question. Tell us about a leader or a book or something that's influenced your approach to leadership.
Yes, actually, my mentor, Steve Shadrack, and I wrote this book. It's called The Fuel and the Flame, and it's for college students. Okay. But it's basically a lot of the stuff I've been talking about: evangelism, disciple making, mission mobilization. And I was writing the book with him. I went to his house in Arkansas, and he's a missions leader. So he started multiple missions organizations. And if I mentioned some of them, you would know what they were. But basically, he's a big time, like, I almost call him a missionary statesman. But that's not the most impressive thing about him. I went and we worked on the book that day. And then I went off to speak at a campus ministry meeting that night. I got home to his house. I was staying at his house. I got home back to his house at about 10 p.m. And there he was with a young adult that he was discipling. And they were praying over some men that they were trying to reach with the gospel, something that the young adult was dealing with in his life. I woke up to fly home the next morning, and he had 2 fraternity presidents that he is trying to share the gospel, and they were doing a Bible study on biblical manhood. His wife, Carol, had made a casserole, and you feed their, stomach, and then you feed their soul, But 6 in the morning, he's outworking me, and he's in his 70s doing ministry, this big time author guy. And I just remember thinking, I never want to grow out of become so much of a leader that I stop being a laborer, that I stop really having that boots on the ground, love for people, taking advantage of those everyday opportunities to share my faith. And so that's what I'm trying to do here in Hawaii. My wife has a group of young adults that she's discipling. I got a group of guys that we'll do discipleship group, and then we'll go surf together. So mixing a little bit of both. So it's so fun.
Paul, thank you so much for your ministry. Thank you for your service to Christ through North American Mission Board, serving on behalf of Southern Baptists. We're grateful for you, and thank you for taking the time to join Leadership Lessons.
It's an honor. I love it. And I'd love to connect with anyone that has any questions about collegiate ministry. I'll give my email, pworcester@nam.net. And so anyone can email me, and I'll get to that email and be able to connect with you guys.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks
for listening to Leadership Lessons. An audio podcast of this program is available on both Apple and Android devices. The Kentucky Baptist Convention was created by churches, for churches, to help churches reach Kentucky and the world for Christ. For more information about the KBC and the cooperative program which fuels our ministry, go to kybaptist.org. We'll see you next time on Leadership Lessons.